My name is Jake. I keep to myself, fix things people throw away. At my girlfriend's family barbecue, her brother stood up and called me a charity case in front of 30 people. He said I was just another broken thing she'd taken in. The silence was worse than the insult. Then he tried to show off, jumped on a tractor with a broken safety and flipped it onto his legs. I was the only one who knew how to get him out. Her name is Lena. She's the kind of person who sees value in things the world has thrown away. Me, I was just a quiet mechanic with a bad leg and a past no one cared to ask about. Her brother Derek looked at me and saw a charity case, a broken man his sister was trying to rescue. That barbecue was my first time meeting the entire family. Derek made sure everyone knew I didn't belong. Then he climbed onto that tractor. And in the seconds before it pinned him, the same crowd that had just watched him humiliate me turned to the only person who could possibly save his life. Me. You need to understand what happened in that moment and what it forced me to decide. Let me tell you who I was before that day. I was a man who fixed things others had given up on. Old engines, rusted tools, broken clocks, anything with gears and a soul left inside it. I worked out of a cramped garage at the edge of town, the kind of place that smelled of oil and coffee and silence. People brought me their failures and I sent them back with new purpose. It was a quiet life. I preferred it that way. I'd earned that silence. 4 years earlier, I'd been a mechanic on a construction crew, the youngest lead they ever promoted. Then a crane cable snapped. A steel beam crushed my right leg. The surgeon saved the limb, but not the man I used to be. I walked with a limp that never left. People started looking at me differently, like I was a warning label come to life. I retreated to the garage and let the machines keep me company. Machines don't pity you. They just need to be fixed. But then Lena walked in. She carried a broken music box her grandmother had left her. The clasp was jammed, the tune a grinding mess, but she held it like it was made of gold. She didn't flinch at the limp or the greasy floor. She just looked at the box and said, "Can you make it sing again?" I said I'd try. It took me 3 days, and when I handed it back, the little bird on top spun and the melody came out clean. She cried, and for reasons I still don't fully understand, she kept coming back. Lena was a social worker, a woman who spent her days pulling people out of impossible situations. She had soft eyes and a spine made of iron. The more time we spent together, the less I felt like a broken part in a scrap bin. She saw me not as a project, but as a person. That mattered more than I can explain, but her family saw it differently. Her brother Derek was the center of their universe. He owned a string of car dealerships, wore expensive boots, and made sure you noticed. To Derek, value was measured in horsepower and credit scores. He called me the charity case long before that barbecue. He'd say it to Lena in private, loud enough for me to hear. "You can't rescue everyone," he'd sneer. "That one's just spare parts." The rest of the family followed his lead. They were polite in the way people are polite to a stray dog at the back door. They assumed I was a phase, another busted thing Lena would eventually tire of fixing. But Lena didn't tire. She just tightened her grip on my hand and told me to ignore them. So I did, for months, until the invitation arrived. It was Derek's annual summer barbecue, a big affair on the family's property. Acres of land, a pond, and a collection of old farm equipment Derek kept around for rustic charm. Lena begged me to come. She said it was time they saw me as part of her life, not just a shadow. I agreed, even though my gut told me otherwise. I cleaned up as best I could, pressed a shirt, and laced my boots over the leg brace. I looked in the mirror and tried to see what Lena saw. But all I saw was a man who didn't belong among the well-fed and the well-dressed. The barbecue was in full swing when we arrived. 30 people, lawn chairs, kids running, the smell of grilled meat. Lena was pulled into a dozen conversations, and I stood near the edge, a glass of lemonade in my hand that felt too fragile to hold. Derek watched me from across the yard, a smirk already forming. Then he tapped his glass with a fork and made a toast. He raised his voice for the whole crowd. "I want to thank everyone for coming, and a special welcome to my sister's new project. Jake here is living proof that with enough charity, even a broken clock gets wound again." The words hit me like a second beam. I stood frozen as laughter rippled through the crowd. Lena's face went white with fury, but before she could speak, Derek held up his hand. "I'm just kidding," He knows I'm kidding. Lighten up. He winked at me, and in that moment I understood something. This wasn't a joke. This was a reminder of my place. I was an outsider, a charity case, and he wanted every guest to know it. My hands clenched. I wanted to leave. I wanted to drive back to my garage and never speak the name Mercer again. But Lena's eyes were pleading with me, full of shame and guilt. So I stood my ground. I said nothing. I let the humiliation settle into my bones. And that's when Derek, still laughing, decided to show off. He'd been drinking. He pointed to a rusted old tractor that sat near the tree line, a thing from the 1960s with a frayed starter cord and a broken safety lock he'd never bothered to fix. You see that machine over there? That's real horsepower, not some busted leg mechanic. Let me show you how a man drives. He climbed onto the seat. I saw the incline where the ground sloped. I saw the loose bolt on the roll bar. I opened my mouth to warn him, but pride is faster than reason. Derek turned the key. The engine coughed to life, and he gunned it hard, jerking forward onto the uneven slope. The tractor bucked. The left tire hit a buried stump. In one sickening second, the entire metal body flipped sideways. The roll bar snapped like a twig. Derek screamed as the machine pinned his legs beneath hot iron and grinding gears, trapping him in the dirt while 30 guests stood paralyzed in shock. And then, in the sudden silence, every single face turned toward me. The charity case. The broken mechanic. The only man on that property who knew how to lift a tractor off a man's body without killing him. I had about 60 seconds before the weight crushed his legs for good, and I had just been told I was nothing. I was already running. The limp didn't slow me. Adrenaline has a way of erasing everything except the thing in front of you. Derek's scream had been cut short, replaced by a guttural moan that told me he was conscious but fatting. His legs were wedged under the rear axle. The weight of the machine settled into the soft earth like a boot on a tin can. I dropped to my knees in the mud and put my hands on the tractor frame. Hot. The engine was still running, grinding against the dirt, threatening to shift further with every vibration. I shouted over my shoulder without looking back. Someone kill the engine. Now. Nobody moved for 2 full seconds. Then Lena's uncle, a retired electrician named Frank, scrambled forward and yanked the kill switch. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. I could hear Derek's breath now, shallow and wet. His eyes were locked on mine, wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the man I was on paper. He wasn't looking at a charity case anymore. I assessed the angle. The tractor had flipped on a slight decline, nose downhill, the full tonnage resting on his left thigh and right shin. If I tried to lift it wrong, the remaining support would collapse and the axle would crush bone into splinters. I needed leverage, a pivot point, something that could redirect the weight without snapping his legs in the process. There's a tow chain in my truck, I said, behind the driver's seat, and I need 4 men, strong ones, near that oak tree with a log. Go. This time they moved. The same people who had laughed at Derek's joke 30 seconds earlier were suddenly a rescue crew. Fear remakes a crowd faster than shame ever can. Lena crouched beside me, her hand on my shoulder, her voice barely holding steady. Jake, can you save him? I looked at her. I didn't make promises I couldn't keep. That wasn't who I was. But I saw the terror in her face, not just for her brother, but for what this moment would mean if I failed. If the charity case couldn't deliver, Derek's blood would stain more than the dirt. It would stain every assumption anyone had ever made about my worth. I left her question unanswered and turned back to the machine. The tow chain arrived, heavy links clinking. I wrapped it around the rear axle housing, double-looped, locking the hook. The 4 men, Frank, a neighbor named Carlos, and 2 of Derek's dealership buddies, dragged a thick oak log into position behind the tractor. I rigged the chain over the log, creating a pulley point that would translate their pull into upward lift instead of sideways drag. Basic physics. But basic physics was the difference between walking again and losing both legs. I stood and faced the men. When I say pull, you pull slow and steady. No jerking. If someone slips, the load shifts. If the load shifts, his femoral artery gets severed and he dies in about 90 seconds. Understand? They nodded, pale and grim. Derek whimpered below me, and I finally looked him in the eye again. Don't move, I said. Not a single muscle. You're going to feel pressure, then pain, then nothing. When it goes nothing, you tell me. That's when your legs are free, nothing before. I counted down from 3. The chain went taut, the log creaked, and slowly, with a groan of tortured metal, the tractor began to rise. Derek screamed, then bit down on it, tears streaming through the dirt on his face. I watched the gap between axle and flesh widen by inches. 1 inch, 2, 3. His left leg was the first to clear, and I saw blood soaking through his jeans, but the bone was intact. The right shin took longer, pinned deeper against a root. 4 inches, 5. Then Derek gasped, "Nothing, nothing." I ordered them to hold position while I dragged him clear, my bad leg screaming at me, but I didn't feel it. I just felt his body sliding free onto the cool grass. The EMTs arrived 12 minutes later, 12 minutes in which I sat in the dirt catching my breath while the barbecue guests stood in clusters, not sure what to say to me. Lena stayed at my side, her hand wrapped around my arm like she was afraid I might disappear. Derek lay on a stretcher board, conscious but in shock, his expensive jeans cut open and his legs immobilized. One of the paramedics, a woman with gray hair and a calm voice, looked at the rig I'd set up and then at me. "You knew what you were doing," she said. "That setup saved his legs, maybe his life." I nodded. I didn't have words yet. The adrenaline was leaving, and in its place came something heavy and cold. The knowledge that I had just saved the life of a man who had humiliated me in front of his entire family, and I didn't know how to feel about that. At the hospital, the Mercer family filled the waiting room like a small army. Derek's wife, Cheryl, wrung her hands and avoided eye contact. His mother, Helen, a stately woman in her 70s, sat perfectly still with a fixed expression that I couldn't read. The dealership buddies hovered near the vending machines, speaking in low tones. I stayed near the exit, ready to leave. I didn't belong in this waiting room any more than I had belonged at their barbecue, but Lena wouldn't let go of my hand. The surgeon came out after 2 hours. Fractured tibia in the right leg, severe muscle damage in the left, but both limbs would survive. There would be surgeries, probably months of physical therapy, but Derek would walk again. When the surgeon finished, Helen Mercer stood up, and for the first time she looked directly at me. Her eyes were red. "You saved my son," she said. Her voice was strained, like the words were being pulled out of her against a lifetime of habit. "I don't understand why, after what he said to you." I didn't have a clean answer, so I gave her the truth. Because letting him die wouldn't have made me less of a charity case. The room went quiet. I felt Lena's fingers tighten around mine. And then I walked out into the hospital parking lot, letting the cold air hit my face, trying to make sense of the storm inside my chest. Lena followed me. She didn't speak. She just stood next to me under the buzzing lights while I breathed. The aftermath began the next day. Derek was stable, but the accident had consequences that rippled far beyond his legs. His car dealerships were heavily leveraged, loans stacked on loans, the kind of financial house of cards that depends entirely on the owner's ability to keep showing up and shaking hands. With Derek hospitalized for months, the lenders got nervous. I learned all this from Lena, who learned it from Cheryl, who was suddenly facing a collapse she hadn't seen coming. And then there was the insurance investigator. The accident happened on private property, on an unmaintained machine with a known broken safety. The company refused to pay out. Derek's medical bills were already climbing past $150,000, and that was before the surgeries. The investigator, a sharp-nosed man named Keller, showed up at my garage 3 days after the accident. He had photos of the tractor, photos of the rig I'd built to lift it. "You seem to know a lot about that machine," he said. "How to start it, how to flip it, how to fix the damage afterward." I stared at him until he looked away. "You think I caused this," I said. "I'm not saying that," Keller replied. "I'm saying your mechanical knowledge puts you in a unique position, and given the bad blood between you and Derek Mercer, it's a question worth asking." I realized then that saving Derek's life hadn't ended the judgment against me. It had simply changed the shape of it. Before, I was a charity case. Now I was a suspect, the man who knew too much about the machine that nearly killed him. The man who had a motive buried under the apparent heroism. Lena was furious when she found out. She wanted to call a lawyer to fight back publicly. But I knew how these things worked. Fighting made you look guilty. Silence made you look guilty. The only thing that would clear my name was proof that the accident was exactly what it was, an accident, caused by Derek's own recklessness and fueled by his own arrogance. Then the first recorded phone call surfaced. One of Derek's dealership buddies, a man named Vince, had been recording the barbecue on his phone to capture the toast. The video was shaky, but the audio was clear. Derek's voice rang out across the lawn. "That's real horsepower, not some busted leg mechanic." And then, seconds before the accident, another voice, mine, barely audible beneath the laughter, saying, "Derek, wait, that safety's broken." The video showed me stepping forward. It showed my hand raised in a warning. And it showed Derek waving me off with a sneer before climbing aboard. Lena got the video from Vince, who had been too ashamed to share it until the insurance investigation put everyone at risk. She played it for me on her phone in the garage. "You tried to stop him," she whispered. "You actually tried to stop him." I watched the screen, the grainy image of myself moving toward the tractor, and I felt something shift. It wasn't vindication. It was grief. Grief for the version of myself that had needed something like this to be believed. The video changed the insurance investigation overnight. Keller closed his file with a terse phone call. No further questions. But the financial damage was already spreading. Derek's lenders were calling in debts. His wife Cheryl came to see me, unannounced, on a rainy Thursday afternoon. She stood in the doorway of my garage, soaked and trembling, and said the words I never expected to hear from the Mercer family. "Need your help." She told me the bank was threatening to seize the dealership properties. The family's assets were tangled in personal guarantees Derek had signed years ago. If the loans defaulted, they could lose everything: the business, the houses, the land where the tractor wreck happened. "Derek doesn't know I'm here," Cheryl said. "He'd rather lose it all than ask you, but I'm not too proud to say it. My husband was wrong about you, and right now you're the only person who might be able to fix this mess." I should have said no. I should have let the Mercer empire collapse under its own weight. But I looked at Cheryl, a woman who had never harmed me, whose only crime was marrying a man who couldn't see past his own ego. And I thought about Lena, who had loved her brother despite everything, who had never asked me to choose between my pride and her family. So I asked Cheryl one question. "What exactly do you think I can fix?" She handed me a folder. Inside were financial statements, lien notices, and a property survey that covered the dealership lots and the family acreage. The land alone was worth something, but it was tangled in complex liens that the bank had exploited for years. The loans weren't just standard mortgages. They were layered instruments, cross-collateralized across multiple properties, some of them written with prepayment penalties that trapped the borrower in permanent debt. I wasn't an accountant, but I was a man who understood systems, gears and leverage. Debt worked the same way. Find the right pivot point and you could shift impossibly heavy loads. I spent 3 days at my workbench with those papers spread across the wood. I didn't sleep much. I made calls to a retired bank officer I'd once rebuilt an engine for. I cross-referenced property values, loan terms, and state regulations on predatory lending. By the end of the 3rd day, I had found the flaw. One of the cross-collateralization clauses violated a state consumer protection statute, a technicality the bank had overlooked for years because nobody had ever challenged them. If the loans could be restructured under the correct legal framework, the Mercer estate would survive. Barely, but it would survive. I brought my findings to Lena first. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where she'd once cried over a music box, and read through my notes. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. "You're going to save them again," she said. I shook my head. "I'm not saving them, I'm just handing them the rope. They have to climb it." I delivered the plan to Cheryl at the hospital. Derek was in a wheelchair by then, his legs casted and his face still pale but conscious and alert. When I walked into the room, he flinched, not from pain, from shame. "I know what you did," he said. "At the barbecue, the video, you tried to warn me." His voice was raw, stripped of its usual bravado. I didn't answer. I just placed the folder on his bedside table. "You're going to lose everything unless you restructure these loans," I said. "The route is outlined in there. It won't be easy. You'll have to sell some properties. You'll have to live smaller, but you won't go bankrupt." Derek stared at the folder, then at me. The silence stretched long and thin. Finally, he spoke. "Why are you helping me?" It was the same question his mother had asked. I gave him the only answer I had. "Because I'm not the man you thought I was." I left him with the folder. I walked out of that hospital for the second time, and this time I didn't feel heavy. I felt lighter than I had in years. But the story wasn't finished, because that folder would set forces in motion that none of us could have predicted. It would expose secrets within the Mercer family that had been buried long before I ever arrived. And it would force Derek to face a truth that was far harder to swallow than crushed bone. The investigation into the loans was about to uncover something his own father had done years ago, something that would make the barbecue humiliation look like a small cruelty in a much larger war. 3 weeks after I handed Derek the folder, the bank sent their own investigator, a retired forensic accountant named Gloria Vance. She was a small woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain and a manner that could freeze water. She didn't care about family feuds. She cared about numbers. And the numbers she found buried in the Mercer estate were older and darker than any of us had guessed. It started with an anomaly in the collateral records. One of the properties used to secure the dealership loans wasn't originally Mercer land at all. It had been acquired 22 years ago through a shell company that dissolved 6 months after the purchase. Gloria traced the shell. It led to a construction firm that no longer existed, Halstead Industrial Contractors. The name hit me like a fist to the sternum. Halstead was the company that ran the site where I lost my leg. I was their lead mechanic. The crane that failed, the cable that snapped, the investigation that got buried, all of it happened under Halstead's watch. And Halstead, according to Gloria's paper trail, had been secretly owned by Arthur Mercer, Derek and Lena's father. I sat in my garage while Gloria laid out the documents on my workbench. I didn't speak for a long time. The silence was thick enough to choke on. Arthur Mercer had died 8 years earlier, a respected businessman with a charitable foundation and a family that revered his memory. But beneath that clean surface, he had built part of his fortune on cut corners, falsified safety inspections, and a collapsed crane that crushed a 26-year-old mechanic's leg. And then he had used the insurance settlement money that was supposed to cover my medical bills and lost wages, to buy the very land that leveraged his son's dealership empire. "Are you certain?" I finally asked. Gloria nodded, her eyes steady. "The records are clean enough to hang him if he were still alive. Payments from Halstead's liability insurer were funneled through the shell and into the property purchase within the same calendar quarter. Your settlement was delayed for years while their lawyers fought your claim. When it finally came, it was a fraction of what you were owed. And the man who signed off on the insurance dispute was Arthur Mercer himself. He wasn't just an investor, he was the principal." The room tilted. I thought about the years of pain, the failed surgeries, the limp that people stared at, the jobs I couldn't do, the girlfriend who left because she couldn't handle a man who couldn't run. I thought about the garage I'd hidden in, the silence I'd wrapped around myself like a burial cloth. All of it flowed from that day the crane cable snapped, and the man responsible had been the father of the woman I loved. Lena found me an hour later still staring at the papers. I didn't hide them. She read slowly, her face changing from confusion to disbelief to a horror so deep it seemed to drain the color from her skin. "My dad did this," she whispered. "He's the reason." She couldn't finish. I finished for her, my voice strange and hollow. "He's the reason I walk like this. The reason I was broke for years. The reason your brother called me a charity case. Because your father took everything from me and left me with scraps, and his son stood on that lawn and humiliated me for being poor." Lena began to cry, not the quiet tears I'd seen before, but full-body sobs that shook the wooden chair beneath her. I wanted to hold her. I wanted to leave the room. I did neither. I just listened to the sound of a family legacy collapsing around us. The next day I called Cheryl and asked her to meet me without Derek. She came to a coffee shop on the edge of town, wary but willing. I told her what Gloria had found. Cheryl's reaction was different. Her face went hard, the face of a woman who had been lied to for years. "Arthur always said the dealership was built on grit and sacrifice," she said bitterly. "He never mentioned it was built on a crushed man." She folded her hands on the table. "Does Derek know?" "Not yet," I said, "but I need to tell him, not for revenge, for the truth. Because if we're going to restructure these loans, the bank needs to know the origin of that collateral is tainted. If they find out first, they'll call everything due immediately and we lose all leverage. Cheryl nodded. Then I'll be there when you tell him. He's going to need to hear it from both of us, and maybe from his mother. Helen Mercer was the hardest to convince. Derek's mother had built her entire widowhood around the shrine of Arthur's memory. When Lena and I sat down with her in the grand living room of the family estate, she listened with a stillness that was more unsettling than any outburst. When we finished, she removed her glasses and polished them slowly. I knew about the Halstead investment, she said quietly. Arthur told me it was a silent partnership. He never said anything about an accident. She paused. I chose not to ask questions. That was my sin as much as his. She looked at me directly. You saved my son twice now, first his legs, then his business. And now you're telling me my husband destroyed your life. What do you want from us, Mr. Cole? The question hung in the air. I didn't have a simple answer. I wanted my leg back. I wanted the years back. I wanted to have never been called a charity case by a man who owed his entire existence to the charity I never received. But what I said aloud was simpler. I want the truth to be known, and I want Derek to hear it from me. The meeting with Derek happened in his hospital room. He was sitting up now, legs still in casts but his color returning. Cheryl stood by the window. Helen sat in a chair near the door. Lena stayed at my side. I placed the documents on the bed tray and walked him through every piece. The shell company, the failed inspection, the severed cable, the settlement delays, the land purchase, the connection to everything he owned. Derek didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He just stared at the papers with a look that slowly transformed from confusion into a grief so raw it made him look younger and broken in a way the tractor couldn't match. When I finished, he spoke in a voice almost too soft to hear. My father ruined you, I nodded, and I never knew. Neither did I until 2 days ago. The silence that followed was the heaviest I've ever felt. Then Derek did something I didn't expect. He reached for the call button and asked the nurse to bring a notary. When the woman arrived, he dictated a statement, a full affidavit acknowledging the debt his family owed me, not in money but in truth. He asked the notary to witness his signature, and then he handed the paper to me. I can't undo what my father did, he said, but I can make sure nobody ever says you're a charity case again. You're not a beneficiary of my family. We're a beneficiary of yours. If it weren't for you, I'd be dead and my family would be bankrupt. Everything I have is because you pulled me out from under that tractor and then gave me a way to save my business. My father took your future. You gave me mine back. I didn't know what to say. Lena was crying again, but this time they were tears of something closer to release. The notary looked uncomfortable, but she stamped the paper and left. The document was legally meaningless. No dollar amount, no repayment. But to me, it was worth more than any settlement. It was a public record that the Mercer legacy was built on my broken body, and that the son was willing to acknowledge it. But the story still had one more twist. Because when Gloria Vance dug deeper into the Halstead files for the bank's restructuring proposal, she found something even darker. Arthur Mercer hadn't just owned the construction company. He had been present on the site the day of the accident. He had personally signed the daily safety log that certified the crane cable had been inspected and cleared, even though maintenance records showed it was 3 months past replacement. He knew the risk and he approved it anyway because swapping the cable would have delayed a critical concrete pour and cost him a 6-figure penalty. He chose a deadline over a man's limb. And then, in an even more horrifying detail, Gloria found a memo from the insurance adjuster, dated 3 weeks after my accident, in which Arthur Mercer argued for a lower settlement on grounds that I had pre-existing mechanical aptitude that enabled alternative employment. He argued that a mechanic could still work while sitting, that my gifts would allow me to earn a living without full mobility. To save his bottom line, he had argued that my skills were so valuable they diminished his liability. Skills I had then used 22 years later to save his son's life and his son's company. The symmetry was so cruel it felt designed. Derek read that memo in front of me, his face crumpled. He used your own talent against you, he said. And then I called you a charity case. I called you a charity case because you were poor when my father made you poor. He looked up, eyes rimmed red. I'm so sorry, Jake. I'm so sorry for my whole life. I didn't think I could accept an apology for an entire lifetime's worth of damage. But standing in that room with Lena's hand in mine and the truth finally stripped bare, I felt something loosen inside me. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of a scar healing from the inside out. I don't need your apology to keep moving forward, I said, but I do need one thing from you. Anything, Derek said. When you're back on your feet, you're going to help me start a foundation for injured workers. You're going to put back some of what your father took, and you're going to do it publicly so everyone in this town knows where your money came from. Derek agreed without hesitation, and then from the corner of the room, Helen Mercer stood up. She walked to me and took both my hands in hers. She was trembling. I spent years protecting my husband's memory, she said. I'm done with that. Whatever you need from this family to set things right, you'll have it. That includes my blessing for you and Lena, if she'll still have you after all this. I looked at Lena, who had been silent through the entire exchange, her face a mixture of sorrow and fierce pride. She didn't speak, but she nodded, and that was enough. That night back at the garage, Lena and I sat on the old truck bench I used as a sofa. She rested her head against my shoulder. I don't know what happens next, she said. I thought I knew my family. I thought I knew my whole life. I turned my head and kissed her hair. We both just learned that the ground we were standing on was never solid, but we're still standing, and now we get to build something new. She looked up at me. Do you hate him, my father? I considered the question carefully. I hated him for years without knowing his name. Now I know his name and I know his family. You aren't him. Derek isn't him, not truly. The man who did those things died thinking he got away with it, but the truth came out anyway. That's enough. The next morning, a town council meeting was called. Derek, still in a wheelchair, asked to speak. I stood at the back of the hall with Lena while he addressed the room. He told them about my accident, about his father's lies, about the memo, about my rescue at the barbecue. He told them that the charity case wasn't me. It was his entire family. Then he announced the foundation. The room was silent for a long moment, then a single pair of hands started clapping. It was Frank, the electrician who had helped lift the tractor. Then others joined. Not a celebration, but an acknowledgement. Afterward, people came up to me. Some apologized for believing Caroline Whitmore. No, wrong story, but wait, this is a different narrative. In this story, they apologized for the whispers, for the way they looked at me after the accident, for the assumptions. Carlos, the neighbor who'd helped with the chain, shook my hand and said, I always knew there was more to you. I was just too slow to say it. I didn't need their apologies, but I took them anyway. Not for me, for the next man who gets broken and then gets blamed for it. But the final verdict wasn't from the crowd. It came 3 days later on a Saturday morning when Derek arrived at my garage. He had traded his wheelchair for crutches, his legs still wrapped but healing. Had a paper in his hand, a deed transfer. Arthur's Shell Company land, the same land bought with my settlement money, was being transferred to my name. Cheryl and I talked, he said. It's not enough, it will never be enough, but it's a start. That land is worth about $200,000. Use it however you want. Sell it, build on it, give it away, it's yours. I looked at the deed. The property address was the place where Halstead Industrial used to stand, where the crane fell, full circle. I took the paper and nodded. Thank you, I said. That was all, but it was a real thank you, unforced. Then Derek spoke again. There's one more thing. I'm asking the county to rename the new service road. I want them to call it Cole Way, so that everyone who drives on it knows it was built by a man who fixed everything we broke. I didn't know what to say, so I just shook his hand, and this time the grip felt even. Two men, neither won a charity case, both given a second chance by forces they didn't deserve. 6 months later, the sign went up. Cole Way. The county had approved the name without much fuss once they saw the affidavit and the bank restructuring. It was a short road, barely a mile long, running past the old Halstead site and curving toward the new industrial park. But every time I drove past it, I remembered the crane cable snapping and the sound of my own leg breaking. And then I remembered Derek on his back under the tractor, learning the same sound from the other side. There is a kind of justice in things that crack open for everyone to see. The foundation launched the same week. We called it the Second Shift Initiative. Its purpose was simple: retrain workers who had been injured on the job, give them the skills to keep earning without being broken twice by the system. Derek funded the first year from the sale of one of his dealerships. I designed the curriculum. We held the first classes in my garage, 6 men and 2 women, all of them with limps and braces and eyes that had seen the bottom. Teaching them felt like reclaiming a language I hadn't spoken aloud in years. Lena brought coffee and sandwiches every afternoon. She had become the bridge between our worlds, a woman who could translate pain into policy and love into action. But the real transformation happened in Derek. Physical therapy is a slow torture, and he endured every session. I started joining him at the rehab center twice a week, not because he asked, but because I knew what it was like to fight a body that had become a stranger. We'd sit on the mats afterward and talk about nothing in particular, engines, baseball, the best way to roast a chicken. Over time, the nothing built something. He told me about the pressure of being Arthur Mercer's son, how he'd spent his whole life trying to fill his father's shoes without ever checking where those shoes had walked. I was so busy trying to be him, he said one afternoon, that I never asked if I should be. That was the moment I truly forgave him, not because he earned it with a deed or a document, but because he was willing to unmask himself in front of me. Lena and I married that autumn. The ceremony was on the family's property, the same land where the barbecue had happened, but everything else was different. The old tractor had been removed, the scar in the grass healed over. We stood under the same oak tree that had almost killed her brother, a different story but still a witness. Father Thomas from the town church officiated. Helen Mercer sat in the front row, her composure finally cracked open with tears she didn't try to hide. Derek stood as my best man, crutches abandoned, a slight hitch in his right leg that would never fully leave. When the vows were spoken, I looked at Lena and saw everything the past 2 years had meant. She wasn't rescuing me. I wasn't rescuing her. We were 2 people who had learned that love isn't about being the hero. It's about staying when staying is hard. The land Arthur had bought with my settlement money became our next project. I could have sold it and pocketed the cash. I could have let it sit vacant as a monument to resentment. Instead, Lena and I proposed turning it into a permanent home for second shift. Derek matched our proposal with an additional endowment. Helen donated Arthur's personal library, hundreds of books on business and ethics, for the center's reading room. The irony was thick enough to touch, but Helen said it best. Let his words serve a purpose he never did. Construction took 14 months. When the building opened, the local news ran a segment on it. I stood in the background while Derek and the mayor cut the ribbon, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not pride exactly, but peace. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 years after the tractor accident, in a yellowed envelope with handwriting I didn't recognize. The return address was a nursing home in Kansas. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written by Arthur Mercer on what must have been his last days. The strokes were shaky, the grammar fragmented, but the message was clear. He wrote, "I have been a coward. I told myself it was business. I told myself a mechanic would land on his feet. I told myself 1,000 lies to avoid one truth. I chose the deadline over your leg. I knew the cable was bad, I knew. And I never said sorry. I'm saying it now, even if you never read this. I'm sorry, Jacob Cole. You were worth more than my profit. I hope you have found your way." A.M. He had written it and never sent it. A nurse found it in his personal effects after his death, along with a note asking that it be delivered to me if I was ever located. By the time Halstead collapsed, I had moved towns and the trail went cold for decades. The nursing home had kept the letter in a file, and a new administrator, cleaning out old records, finally tracked me down through the Second Shift website. I read the letter 3 times. Then I called Lena out to the garage and read it to her. She wept not for her father's redemption, but for the years of silence. "He was too ashamed to even mail it," she said. I folded the paper carefully. "But he wrote it. That counts for something." I don't know if I believe that entirely, but I know that holding the apology in my hand felt different than never receiving one at all. It closed a door I'd learned to ignore, but which had never stopped being there. That evening, I drove to the new Second Shift Center. A night class was in session, welding fundamentals. I watched through the window as a young woman in a wheelchair manipulated the torch with focused precision. I didn't go in. I just stood there, the letter in my pocket, and let the reality settle around me. Arthur Mercer had taken my leg, but the skills he'd argued were so valuable, skills he used to deny me compensation, had now equipped dozens of injured workers to earn back their dignity. His son had become my partner. His daughter had become my wife. And the land he stole had become a place where broken people got fixed. The next morning, I placed the letter in a frame and hung it in the center's lobby, next to the photograph of Arthur Mercer that Helen had donated. I didn't do it to shame him. I did it because the full story matters. The man who wrote that letter was the same man who signed the falsified safety log. The family that once called me a charity case was the same family that now funded my life's work. Redemption is not a clean line. It's a scar over a wound that someone else put there. That summer, Derek announced he was running for county council. His platform included worker safety reform, small business debt relief, and a permanent injury compensation fund modeled on the foundation. He asked me to manage his campaign's outreach. I said yes. We spent weekends driving to union halls and community centers, two men with matching limps and a story that people couldn't quite believe until they saw us standing together. At one stop, an old construction worker raised his hand and asked, "How do we know you're not just using this for votes?" Before I could respond, Derek took the mic. "Because I was the joke," he said. "I was the loudmouth who called him a charity case, and he still dragged me out from under a tractor. I owe him my legs and my business. If I ever forget that, you can vote me out." The room went quiet, then applauded. I looked at Derek and saw a man I was proud to know. Lena and I had our first child 2 years after the center opened. A girl. We named her Hope because Lena said the world needed more of it. Helen was the first to hold her after us, her wrinkled hands cradling the baby with a gentleness that erased the distance between generations. Derek spoiled her with toys and later taught her to drive a tractor safely, with all the guards in place. I built a music box for her first birthday, the same model as the one Lena had brought to my garage. The little bird spun and the melody came out clean. When Lena heard it, she laid her hand on my arm and didn't speak. She didn't have to. The story that started with a broken clock, a snapped cable, and a cruel toast ended with a family that had been broken and remade. I still walk with a limp. The scar isn't going anywhere. But I learned that the measure of a man isn't what the world takes from him. It's what he builds with what's left. And in the end, the charity case wasn't the man who needed help. It was the man who refused to give it. Every morning now, I drive down Cole Way, past the center, past the fields where the old Halstead site used to be. I see students with canes and prosthetics walking into class. I see Lena's garden blooming behind our house. I hear my daughter laughing. And I know that the quiet life I once wanted was never really quiet at all. It was just waiting for the right noise to fill it. Looking back now, I realize that the entire story hinges on a single, fragile moment. If I had let my pride answer for me, Derek would have lost his legs or his life. If I had refused to look at those loan papers, the Mercer family would have collapsed. If I had hoarded my anger instead of reading that letter, I might still be standing in a cold garage, feeling cheated by the universe. But the universe doesn't deal in fairness. It deals in moments. And what you do in those moments defines whether you stay a victim or become something else. Most people will never have a tractor fall on their enemy, but everyone will face a choice between resentment and repair. The world is full of people who will label you, diminish you, call you a charity case or a failure or a burden. They do it because labels are easier than looking at a person's full weight. The real test isn't whether those labels stick, it's whether you let them govern your next move. Derek called me a charity case, and 30 seconds later, I had to decide if his life mattered more than my wounded ego. I chose his life. That choice set off a chain reaction I could never have predicted. It exposed a decades-old lie. It rebuilt a family. It turned my own suffering into a tool that now helps hundreds of others. The question I want you to sit with is this: who in your life have you labeled unfairly? And what would change if you saw them clearly, without the story you've told yourself about their worth? Because the charity case might be the person holding the chain when the weight comes down. The broken thing might be the very tool that saves you. I walked with a limp before the accident, and I walk with one still, but the limp no longer feels like a punishment. It feels like a reminder that strength and injury are not opposites. They often live in the same body. That quiet life I once wanted turned out to be anything but quiet. It became loud with forgiveness, messy with rebuilding, and full of people who started out as strangers and became a family. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear that being broken does not disqualify you from being valuable. And if you want more real stories of unexpected redemption, subscribe and turn on notifications. I'll see you in the next one.